He moved into the cabin, where 3 people had vanished without a trace. And when he discovered why, he realized he was walking the exact same path they had. Can you imagine the desperation of a man who has lost everything? His reputation destroyed by lies, rejected by every corner of the world, forced to accept the one shelter no one else dared to inhabit. This story took place in the deep interior of Montana in May of 1889, in a settlement so small it didn't even merit a dot on the territorial maps. Before we continue, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from right now. I love knowing that these old-time tales are reaching so many different places. Every comment encourages me to bring you more stories like this one. And if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapters. It really helps me keep these narratives coming for you. Martin Caldwell was 34 years old when his life collapsed like a house of cards in a gale. For 12 years, he had been the foreman of the Double E Ranch, one of the largest cattle operations in the Yellowstone Valley. He knew every acre of that land, every steer by its markings, and every ranch hand by their character. He was respected, carried authority, and earned a wage that allowed him to squirrel away a few dollars every month. He planned to save enough to buy his own patch of earth, maybe marry, build something that was truly his. Everything changed on a bitter cold night in March of 1887. The boss, Colonel Fenton, summoned Martin to the study of the big house. The man's face was beet red with rage, his hands trembling as he clutched a ledger. 50 head of cattle gone from the north pasture, he accused, his voice booming like thunder. And the tally books don't match what was sold at the stockyards in Billings. Martin felt the floor drop out from under him. He explained that he had reported exactly what was sold, that he had never touched a single animal without authorization, that his honor was worth more than any amount of money. The colonel wouldn't hear it. He accused Martin of siphoning off stock for years, of cooking the books, of stealing the trust of the man who gave him a livelihood. He ordered him off the ranch immediately, without his last 3 months of back pay, without a letter of reference, with nothing but the clothes on his back and his own saddle horse. Martin tried to defend himself, demanded they call the marshal to investigate, swore on his mother's grave he was innocent. The colonel threatened to call the law not to investigate, but to hang Martin for rustling. Martin rode out that very night, tasting the copper tang of injustice for the first time in his life. In the months that followed, he discovered that Colonel Fenton himself had sold the cattle off the books to cover gambling debts, using Martin as the perfect scapegoat. But when he tried to clear his name, he found only slammed doors. The word of a colonel was worth more than the truth of a hired hand. No ranch would hire him, no merchant would extend him credit. His name became synonymous with thief in a territory where reputation was the only currency that mattered. For 2 years, Martin drifted through the backcountry, taking odd jobs that paid in nothing but beans and a bunk. He broke rocks for road crews, swamped out saloons, mucked stables, did every kind of work a man of honor does when honor no longer buys bread. His savings of 12 years were drained by a shyster lawyer who promised to overturn the accusations but only piled on debt. His horse had to be sold. His good boots were traded for flour. His Sunday suit became his everyday rags. In May of 1889, Martin arrived in Dry Creek with exactly 50 cents in his pocket and the certainty that he had hit rock bottom. The settlement was tiny, maybe 200 souls, wedged between hills covered in thick stands of ponderosa pine and fir. A single dirt main street, with Moore's General Store on one side, a clapboard church on the other, about 15 houses scattered around, and nothing else but heavy silence and suspicious glares. Martin stepped into Moore's General Store looking for news of work or cheap lodging. The owner, Jacob Moore, was a man in his 50s, dressed too well for such a dusty town, with a gold watch chain draped across his vest and a gold ring on his pinky finger. He had grey hair, slicked back with pomade, a trimmed moustache, and soft hands that hadn't seen a day of hard labour. His eyes, however, were hard as flint. Jacob listened as Martin explained he was looking for any work, any roof that would fit a poor man's budget. The merchant studied Martin from top to bottom, noting the worn but clean clothes, the upright posture despite the defeat, the calloused hands of a man who knew the value of a day's work. "There's a cabin available," Jacob said finally. "It's at the edge of town, past the last houses, near the woods. Been empty for about 8 months. You can have it for 50 cents a month." Martin found the price suspiciously low, but he wasn't in a position to haggle. He accepted immediately, handing over his last coins. Jacob took the money with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Keys in the door," he informed him. "Place needs a sweep, but the walls are sturdy." Then he added something Martin would only understand later. "Lots of folks have passed through there." As Martin left the store, he noticed the clerk, Mrs. Higgins, a thin woman of about 60, weighing flour behind the counter, had stopped working and was watching him with an expression of profound pity. She opened her mouth as if to speak, glanced at Jacob, who was chatting with another customer, and pressed her lips tight again. She simply made a discreet sign of the cross as Martin walked past. The walk to the cabin took 20 minutes. Martin passed the last houses of the settlement, each spaced further apart than the last, until the road became a trail, and the trail became a path through the trees. Women washing clothes in their yards stopped to watch him. Children playing in the dirt went quiet. An old-timer sitting on a porch spat tobacco juice on the ground and turned his head away. The silence that accompanied Martin was too heavy to be just small-town curiosity about a stranger. The cabin appeared suddenly in a small clearing, hemmed in by giant pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was a simple structure of dark logs, chinked with mud, roofed with cedar shakes now covered in moss, a window on either side of the front door. It looked to be about 15, maybe 20 years old. What caught Martin's eye was the state of sudden abandonment. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze coming down off the hills. There were clothes hanging on a sideline, rotted grey from months of exposure. The small wooden pen that should have held chickens was smashed, the gate torn off its hinges. Martin pushed the door, which groaned on rusty hinges. The smell that wafted out was must, damp wood, and something else he couldn't place. Inside was a main room serving as parlour and kitchen, with a cast-iron stove in the corner, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and shelves with a few plates and pans. A side door led to what had to be the bedroom. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. What unsettled Martin was the feeling that someone had left in a hurry, abandoning an entire life without warning. There was a pot on the stove, with the remains of food completely dried out, likely beans that had turned into black stones. A tin cup knocked over on the table. A chair toppled on the floor. In the bedroom, the bed was unmade, sheets thrown back haphazardly, as if the person had risen one morning and never returned. There were even clothes folded on a wooden trunk in the corner. Martin tossed the cabin looking for signs of robbery or struggle, but found nothing, just sudden abandonment. He searched the trunk and found a few belongings: a simple woman's dress, a wool shawl, a prayer book, a rosary of black beads, the effects of a religious woman, likely someone humble. He packed it all back away with the respect due to another's property. The daylight was beginning to fade when Martin finished the basic cleaning. He tossed out the petrified food, swept the dirt floor, shook out the bedding, and hung it to air out. He lit the kerosene lamp he found full on the shelf, another strange sign of hasty departure. He brewed coffee with the last grounds he had in his pack and sat on the doorsill to drink it while watching night descend over the forest. The silence was absolute. No crickets, no nightbirds, no wind in the needles. just a silence as thick as a wet wool blanket. Martin, who had slept under the stars during thunderstorms on cattle drives, who had camped on desolate plains where the only sound was a wolf's howl, felt for the first time in years a shiver that didn't come from the cold. There was something wrong with this quiet, something that made the hair on his arms stand up for no apparent reason. He finished his coffee and retreated inside, barring the door with the wooden beam. He lay on the bed, which creaked with every shift of weight, and tried to sleep. The exhaustion of days of walking should have knocked him out immediately, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay staring at the dark timber ceiling, listening to the house settle as the temperature dropped. That was when he heard the first sound. It came from below, a long creak, like wood under pressure. Then silence. Then another creak, shorter. Martin sat up in bed, wide awake. He waited. The sound repeated, this time accompanied by something that sounded like scratching. Wood scraping on wood or metal on stone, he couldn't tell. He got up slowly, took the lamp, and examined the bedroom floor. Wide wooden planks, tight together, no visible gaps. He moved to the main room and did the same inspection. The sound had stopped. Martin convinced himself it was some critter that had made a den under the house, maybe a badger or a skunk. He went back to bed, but sleep remained elusive. And around midnight, when the chill of the witching hour set in, the sound returned. This time clearer, more defined. Muffled footsteps. Someone or something was walking underneath the cabin. Martin vaulted out of bed, grabbed the lamp and the bowie knife he carried in his pack. His heart was hammering, but his mind was cold, alert. He examined the main room floor inch by inch, tapping the planks with the hilt of his knife, listening for a hollow sound that would indicate empty space. The cabin had been built directly on the earth, without a stone foundation, common for poor constructions. There shouldn't be enough space for anyone to walk underneath. That was when he noticed that 3 planks in the darkest corner of the room, near the stove, had a slightly different color than the others. They were the same type of wood, but looked newer, less worn. Martin knelt and ran his fingers along the seams. He felt a nearly imperceptible movement. The planks weren't nailed down like the others, they were just fitted in. Carefully, using the knife as a lever, Martin pried up the first plank. Below was complete darkness. He raised the lamp and saw crude wooden steps leading down into what looked like a root cellar. The air that drifted up was cold and heavy with dampness, smelling of earth and something else, something sickly sweet and foul that made his stomach turn. Martin took a deep breath, gripped the lamp firmly, and began to descend. There were 7 steep steps. The cellar ceiling was so low he had to hunch over. The space was maybe 10 feet by 12, with dirt walls shored up by vertical logs. The floor was dirt too, but packed down hard and leveled with care. In the right corner, there were 3 objects that made Martin's blood run cold. A brown felt hat, battered by use. A bone-handled knife in a leather sheath, and a black bead rosary identical to the one he had found in the trunk upstairs. 3 objects, 3 different people. And the inescapable feeling that these were belongings left by folks who were never coming back to claim them. Martin picked up the hat and examined it in the lamplight. Inside the band, a name was embroidered in faded thread: Lewis Miller. The knife had initials carved into the handle: A.P. The rosary, he already knew, belonged to the woman whose dress was still in the trunk. But what really made Martin back up to the stairs was what he saw on the far wall. There was a narrow opening, almost hidden behind one of the support logs, a tunnel, dug into the earth, shored up with timber, too narrow for a man to walk upright, but wide enough to crawl. The darkness inside was total, and a draught of cold air came from the opening, carrying the scent of the forest, wet earth and decay. Martin climbed out of the cellar with shaking legs. It wasn't fear. It was the sudden realization that he had agreed to live in a place where terrible things had happened. He replaced the planks, dragged the heavy table over the trapdoor, and sat in one of the chairs, knife in his lap, waiting for dawn. The rest of the night passed in absolute silence. No sound came from the cellar, no creaking, no footsteps, nothing. But Martin couldn't close his eyes again. He stayed there, watching the crack of light in the window gradually brighten, until the first rays of sun entered the cabin, bringing heat and an illusory sense of safety. When day broke completely, Martin made a decision. He wouldn't run. He had run from false accusations, from injustice, from poverty, but he wouldn't run from fear. He needed to understand what had happened in this cabin. Who were Lewis Miller, AP, and the woman with the rosary? Why had they abandoned everything? Where did that tunnel lead? And most importantly, why had Jacob Moore smiled that way when he rented the cabin for a price that wouldn't buy a chicken? Martin washed his face at the spring behind the cabin, changed his shirt, and walked back into town. It was Sunday morning, and families were walking toward the wooden church for service. Martin followed the flow and entered the sanctuary, sitting in the last pew watching. Father Stanislaus was an old man, perhaps 70, bent by time but with a firm voice that echoed in the small nave. He preached about charity, about welcoming the stranger, about not judging one's neighbor. As he spoke, Martin noticed several people turning their heads discreetly to look at him. Jacob Moore was in the front pew with his family, a heavy-set wife in a fine dress, 3 grown children. Beside him sat a huge man with broad shoulders and a face that promised trouble, whom Martin immediately pegged as a hired gun or enforcer. After Mass, Martin waited for everyone to leave and approached the priest in the sacristy. Father Stanislaus was removing his vestments, folding them carefully into a wooden chest. He looked at Martin with an expression that mixed curiosity and worry. "You're the new fellow who arrived yesterday," he stated, rather than asked. "I saw you at Mass." Martin introduced himself and got straight to the point. "Father, I need to know about the cabin where I'm living. 3 people lived there before me. Lewis Miller, someone with the initials AP, and a woman. They all abandoned the place suddenly. What happened to them?" The priest's face turned grey. He sat on a bench in the sacristy, suddenly looking even older. "My son, you shouldn't be in that place," he said with a heavy voice. "No one should." Martin sat beside him. "But I am, Father, and I'm not leaving until I understand what happened. I'd rather know the truth than live in the dark." The priest sighed deeply, glanced at the door to ensure they were alone, and began to speak. Lewis Miller came to Dry Creek in January of 1888. He was a drover who lost his herd to rustlers near the Badlands. He stayed in the cabin for 6 months. Quiet man, worked odd jobs, never bothered a soul. In July of 88, he just vanished, left everything behind. Had clothes, even the money he kept in a clay jar. His family in Miles City looked for him for months, but he was never found. The priest paused, his voice dropping lower. Arthur Pierce, the initials AP, arrived 2 weeks after Lewis disappeared. He was a blacksmith looking for a place to set up a forge, stayed in the cabin 3 months. Strong man, good with his hands, business was picking up. In October of 88, he disappeared the same way, left his anvil, his tools, everything. That knife you likely found was his favorite. He never went anywhere without it, but they both vanished, him and the knife. Martin felt his stomach tighten. And the woman? Felicity Ramos, the priest said, his voice choking up. A widow of 50, very religious, no family nearby. Arrived last August. She stayed only 5 weeks. Disappeared in September. The rosary she always carried was left behind. Felicity was never apart from that rosary. It was her mother's. It was after her that no one else wanted to live in the cabin. Until you. "Why does Jacob Moore rent the place knowing this?" Martin asked. The priest looked at him with an unreadable expression. "Because Jacob owns the cabin," he answered finally. "He built it about 15 years ago, and apparently he doesn't care what happens inside." Martin walked back to the cabin with his mind racing. 3 people, 3 disappearances. 3 objects left in the cellar like trophies, or warnings, or proof of something terrible, and Jacob Moore at the center of it all, renting the cabin to desperate folks who had nowhere else to turn. For the next 3 days, Martin didn't go down to the cellar again. He spent his time exploring the area around the cabin, looking for where the tunnel might come out. The woods were dense, towering pines with trunks 6 feet across, high ferns, tangled undergrowth. Impossible to penetrate without a machete and a lot of patience. It was on Thursday that Martin decided to investigate the tunnel. He prepared by taking the lamp, his knife, a rope, and water. He moved the table, pried up the planks, and descended into the cellar. The 3 objects were still there, silent witnesses to past tragedies. Martin approached the tunnel opening, crouched down, and went in. The space was tight, forcing him to crawl with difficulty, pushing the lamp ahead of him. The packed earth walls were reinforced every 6 feet with vertical logs and horizontal headers, work of someone who knew what they were doing, someone with experience in mining. The tunnel went in a straight line, sloping gently downward. After crawling for what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than 15 minutes, Martin saw faint light ahead. The tunnel ended in an opening camouflaged by bushes and ferns. He pushed through the vegetation and emerged into a small clearing, completely hidden from the main trail by the density of the forest. What he saw there made his blood freeze for the second time. There were 3 mounds of earth on the clearing floor, 3 shallow graves, fresh, covered by a thin layer of dry leaves. And the smell coming from them, sweet and nauseating, was unmistakable to anyone who had worked on a ranch and seen dead livestock. Martin didn't need to dig to know what was buried there. Lewis Miller, Arthur Pierce, Felicity Ramos, the 3 people who had lived in the cabin before him, murdered and buried in that hidden clearing, accessible only by the tunnel that started in the cabin's cellar. The cabin was a trap, and Martin had fallen into it like a fool bird, flying straight for the snare. Martin recoiled from the stench of the graves and crawled back through the tunnel, breathing fast, not from fear, but from a cold rage beginning to boil in his chest. When he emerged in the cabin cellar, he knelt there on the dirt floor, letting his mind work with the cold calculation he had learned in 12 years of handling cattle, wild horses, and dangerous situations. 3 dead people. A deliberately built tunnel, a cabin offered for pennies to desperate people, and Jacob Moore owning it all. The question hammering in his head was simple. Why? Men don't kill 3 people without a reason. They don't build elaborate tunnels without a purpose. They don't keep a trap baited for over a year without a clear objective. There was something in that cabin, or in that earth, worth 3 human lives. Maybe more, if Martin didn't find out what it was before becoming the 4th victim. He climbed out of the cellar, replaced the planks, and walked out of the cabin. The midday sun was burning strong, and the contrast between the light outside and the darkness of the tunnel made his eyes sting. He walked to the spring, washed his face and hands that were still trembling slightly, and made a decision. He couldn't go to the law without concrete proof. The word of a man accused of theft against a respected merchant meant nothing. He needed to understand the motive, discover the connection between the victims, find what Jacob was looking for. Martin returned to town late in the afternoon when the activity was at its peak. He walked into Jacob's store again, this time to buy provisions. The merchant was behind the counter, tallying figures in a large ledger. He raised his eyes when Martin entered, and something changed in his expression, a nearly imperceptible hardening, a quick appraisal. "How are you settling in at the cabin?" he asked, his voice too casual. "Fine," Martin replied. "Place is quiet. Just need a few things. Flour, beans, coffee if you have it, and kerosene for the lamp. While Jacob gathered the goods, Martin observed the store. It was a large establishment for such a small town, shelves stocked with varied merchandise. Hardware, bolts of cloth, tools, foodstuffs, even an imported wall clock hanging in the back. A business too prosperous for a place where most folks barely had money for the basics. Mrs. Higgins, the clerk who had been there the day Martin arrived, was weighing beans with nervous movements. She avoided looking directly at him, but Martin sensed she wanted to say something. Jacob handed over the goods and charged a fair price. Martin paid and was leaving when he heard the woman's voice, low and fast. "Watch your dreams tonight, mister. Sometimes we dream of things that have already happened." Jacob snapped his head around. "Mrs. Higgins, go fetch more flour from the back," he ordered with a cutting voice. The woman lowered her head and hurried away. Martin left the store feeling Jacob's eyes glued to his back. That night, Martin didn't sleep in the cabin. He set everything up as if he were going to bed, lit the lamp, rumpled the sheets. Then he climbed out the back window and hid in the nearby woods, at a vantage point where he could watch the whole cabin. If Jacob had a habit of visiting his victims at night, Martin wanted to see it. The hours passed slowly. The crescent moon gave little light, but enough to distinguish movement. Around midnight, Martin heard muffled footsteps coming up the trail. 2 figures appeared. Even in the gloom, he recognized Jacob Moore by his bearing and hat. The other was the massive henchman he'd seen at church, the broad-shouldered man named Bart. The two stopped 20 yards from the cabin. Jacob watched the lamplight in the window, the smoke rising from the chimney. "Still awake," Bart muttered with a gravelly voice. Jacob replied something Martin couldn't catch, and the two stood there for long minutes, just watching. Finally, Jacob signaled, and they turned back down the trail. Martin waited another hour before returning to the cabin. Now he was certain. Jacob watched whoever lived there. He was waiting for the right moment. But for what? What was he looking for that he hadn't found yet? The next morning, Martin went back to the church. He found Father Stanislaus sweeping the empty nave. The old priest didn't seem surprised by his presence. "I knew you'd come back," he said simply. "There are questions you didn't ask yesterday." Martin was blunt. "Father, before those 3 people disappeared, did anyone else vanish from that cabin? How long has it been there?" The priest leaned the broom against the wall and sat on a pew. "The cabin was built in 1875, he replied. 14 years ago. Jacob was young then, a poor squatter who worked for whoever would pay. I never understood how he got the money to build that property and open the store. Happened suddenly, over a 6-month period. Went from a man with nothing to an established merchant. And before Lewis, did anyone disappear from there?" "Not from the cabin," the priest said slowly. "But there was a disappearance in 1875 that was never solved. A German peddler named Frederick Bauer passed through Dry Creek in April of that year, said he was heading to Great Falls to open a trading post. He had money, everyone saw it. Paid for lodging at Widow Celeste's house with gold coins, stayed 3 days, bought supplies, and left on the trail leading to the high plains. Never made it to Great Falls." Martin felt something click in his mind. "And when exactly did this happen?" The priest stood and went to the sacristy. He returned with an old parish register. He leafed through it until he found the page. Here, Frederick Bauer, German peddler, 38 years old. Last seen in Dry Creek on April 23, 1875. Lodged 3 days at Celeste Taverner's boarding house. Departed morning of April 23rd, heading for Great Falls. Never seen again. The sheriff investigated at the time, found nothing. Presumed he was waylaid and killed somewhere on the road. Martin made a mental note of the dates. April 1875. 6 months later, Jacob had the money to build a cabin and open a store. The connection was too clear to be a coincidence. "Father, did anyone suspect Jacob at the time?" "Ubitum," the priest closed the book carefully. "Many people suspected, but Jacob had an alibi. The night Frederick left, Jacob was working at the sawmill with 10 other men. Witnesses confirmed it, and they never found the German's body, nor the money, nor any proof. Over time, the suspicions died. Jacob built a reputation as an honest man, married well, had children, became a pillar of the community. Martin thanked him and left the church, his mind working fast. The story was coming together. Jacob, or someone working with him, had killed the German peddler in 1875 and stolen the gold. But something went wrong. The money vanished, or was hidden, or buried. For years, Jacob searched. He built the cabin over the spot where he suspected the gold was. And now, 13 years later, he was using desperate people as involuntary excavators. When they found something, they were eliminated and buried in the hidden clearing. But there was a problem with this theory. If Jacob knew where the gold was, why not retrieve it himself? Why need other people living in the cabin? Unless he didn't know exactly where it was, unless the body of the German and the gold were buried somewhere near the cabin, but not under it, unless Jacob was waiting for someone to stumble upon the answer. Martin spent the next 2 days digging, not looking for gold, but looking to understand. He examined every inch of the cellar. He tapped the earthen walls looking for hollow sounds. He measured the dimensions of the cellar and compared them with the exterior dimensions of the cabin. He went back down the tunnel and examined the walls, looking for deviations, side chambers, anything that indicated deeper excavation. It was on the 3rd day that he found it. Not gold, but a clue. In the northeast corner of the cellar, the earth on the wall had a different color. Lighter, looser. Martin began to dig with his hands, then with a piece of wood. 20 inches deep, his fingers touched something hard. He dug around it and pulled. It was a piece of rotted fabric, likely canvas from a sack. And inside it, 2 gold coins that had slipped out. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves thrilling tales from the old days. It really helps the channel grow. Martin held the coins up to the lamplight. They were heavy, genuine. One of them bore the mint date, 1868, $10 gold eagles, the German peddler's gold, or at least part of it. But if there were 2 coins here, where was the rest? Why were only these left behind? The answer came as a sudden realization. The sack had been buried there, likely in a hurry, on the night of the murder, but later it was dug up and moved. These 2 coins fell out during the transfer, got buried in the loose dirt, and whoever moved them didn't notice. The gold wasn't there anymore. It was somewhere else. But where? Martin was packing the dirt back in when he heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy, decisive. He froze, gripping his knife. Jacob Moore's voice drifted down to the cellar. "Come up slow, Martin, and bring what you found." There was no choice. Martin climbed the steps with the 2 coins in one hand and his knife in the other. In the main room, Jacob was accompanied by Bart. The henchman had an old but functional shotgun, pointed casually in Martin's direction. Jacob looked at the coins and smiled without any humor. "So you're smarter than the other 3. They took weeks to find that." Martin gripped the coins tight. "You killed the German peddler in 75, stole his gold, but you lost it. And you're using this cabin as bait, hoping someone finds where you yourself buried it and forgot." Jacob sat in a chair with disturbing tranquility. "Almost right. I didn't kill Frederick Bauer. It was my partner, Manuel Garden. I was a young fool who agreed to help. The plan was simple. Manuel would kill the German on the road, steal the gold, and we'd split it 50-50. 300 coins, according to what Frederick flashed, while drinking at the saloon. Wealth enough to change 2 lives. "And what went wrong?" Martin asked, buying time. "Manuel went wrong," Jacob replied with ancient bitterness. "He killed the German, took the gold, buried the body somewhere only he knew, and came back to tell me the German had fled, that he hadn't found him. Lied to my face. But I knew. Saw the fresh dirt on his clothes, the poorly washed blood. And 2 weeks later, Manuel bought this land here, built this cabin, started spending like a man with hidden money. Jacob paused, eyes fixed on some point in the past. I waited. I was patient. I knew Manuel had buried the gold near the cabin, likely planned to retrieve it bit by bit, without raising suspicion. But 3 months after building the cabin, Manuel had an accident at the sawmill. Big Saw took his arm, gangrene set in, died in 5 days of fever, and took the secret with him. So you inherited the cabin, Martin completed. Bought it from the widow for a generous price, Jacob corrected, and spent years searching. Dug up the entire floor of this damned cabin inch by inch. Nothing. Dug around it, in the woods, in the surroundings. Nothing. The gold was here, I knew it. But where? Finally, I realized Manuel had been smarter. Dug deep, hid it well, maybe even under the structure of the cabin itself so I couldn't find it without destroying everything. And the 3 who died? Martin asked, voice controlled. Jacob shrugged. Lewis found 4 coins under the floorboards of the bedroom. Arthur found 7 coins digging in the cellar. Felicity found 11 coins in a crack in the wall. They all thought they had discovered hidden treasure. They all came to me, proud, wanting to negotiate. They're all in the clearing now. Bart grunted something and Jacob agreed. The problem, Martin, is that's only 24 coins total. 24 out of 300. The rest is here, I know it is. I've waited almost 14 years, I'm not stopping now. Martin calculated the distance to the door. Impossible with the shotgun pointed at him. And what happens to me now? Jacob stood up. Depends. You can be smart and keep looking. When you find it, we split. 150 coins for each of us. Or you can be a fool like the other 3 and try to blackmail me. In that case, well, you've already seen the clearing. And if I just walk away? Jacob smiled. And live how? No money, no reputation, no future. You arrived here at rock bottom, Martin. I checked on you. Ex-foreman accused of theft, who will never get decent work again. Your only chance to rebuild your life is finding that gold. 300 coins split is still a fortune that changes destiny. Think about it. Jacob signaled to Bart, and the 2 left, leaving Martin alone with 2 coins in his hand and an impossible choice in front of him. He could accept the proposal and look for the gold, becoming an accomplice to 3 murders. He could run and live the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. Or he could do what he knew was right, even if it cost him everything. Martin put the coins in his pocket and sat in the chair Jacob had occupied. His mind went back to his 12 years as foreman. How many times had he dealt with dishonest hands? How many times had he needed to be smarter than rustlers, faster than liars, more patient than cheats? Jacob thought he was offering an opportunity, but he was making a fatal mistake. He was underestimating a man who had spent a whole decade reading people, anticipating moves, building strategies. For the next 3 days, Martin pretended to look for the gold. He dug new holes in the cellar, examined walls, made noise and movement. But what he was really doing was watching. Bart passed by the cabin twice, always in the late afternoon, always by the same path. Jacob appeared once, asked if there was progress, left when Martin said he was still searching. On the 4th day, Martin went to the small shop at the other end of town, far from Jacob's store. It was a poor establishment run by Mrs. Higgins and her sick husband. The woman went pale when she saw him enter. He closed the door and got straight to it. Mrs. Higgins, you tried to warn me the first day. I need your help now. The woman looked around fearfully. I can't get mixed up in this, mister. Jacob is a dangerous man. He's ruined folks who crossed him. Martin placed the 2 gold coins on the counter. He killed 3 people. He'll kill me too if I don't find what he's looking for. Do you want another death on your conscience? Mrs. Higgins looked at the coins, then at Martin. Her hands shook as she picked up the gold pieces and examined them. I knew Frederick Bauer, she said finally, voice low. He was a good man, bought some lace I made, paid more than it was worth, said it was for his fiancée in Great Falls. When he disappeared, I knew. Everyone knew. But nobody spoke, because Jacob already had too much power. Martin leaned over the counter. I need someone who can testify, someone the law will listen to. Law? Mrs. Higgins almost shouted. What law? The sheriff in this county is in Jacob's pocket. Martin smiled without joy. Then let's go find some law that isn't. That night Martin rode to the town of Big Timber, 3 hours away. He used the 2 gold coins to buy a horse from a breeder who didn't ask questions. At the sheriff's office in town, he asked to speak to the authority in charge. He was met by a man of about 40, tall and lean, with a thick mustache and eyes that assessed everything. Sheriff Otis Sever, he introduced himself. What brings a stranger to my office in the middle of the night? Martin told him everything. The 3 disappearances, the graves in the clearing, the secret cellar, the tunnel, the German peddler's gold, Jacob Moore and Bart, the partnership offer, the coins found. He spoke for half an hour straight, while the sheriff listened with an increasingly intrigued expression. When Martin finished, Otis Sever opened a drawer and pulled out a file of papers. Felicity Ramos, he said. Her niece filed a formal missing persons report 7 months ago. Didn't buy the story that her aunt just picked up and left without a word. I've been investigating quietly since then, without proof, without a body, without witnesses. I couldn't act. But now you've brought me exactly what I needed. The sheriff stood up and grabbed his hat. Let's go back to Dry Creek. You're going to keep pretending you're looking for the gold. I'm going to show up in town tomorrow like I'm on routine patrol. I'll ask discreet questions, observe behavior, apply a little pressure. Jacob will get nervous. Nervous men make mistakes, and when he makes one, I'll be waiting. Martin and the sheriff returned to Dry Creek before dawn. Otis Sever boarded at Widow Celeste's house, the same place where Frederick Bauer had stayed 14 years earlier. During the day, he circulated through the village, asking questions about the disappearances, talking to every resident, examining church records. Martin saw when Jacob learned of the sheriff's presence. The merchant turned white, then red, then controlled his expression. But his hands trembled slightly as he scooped flour for a customer. Bart appeared at the store minutes later, and the two conversed in low voices in the back. That night, Bart visited the cabin. Martin was ready. The henchman entered without knocking, shotgun in hand. Jacob sends word, he grumbled. The sheriff leaves tomorrow, or he has an accident. You didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, don't know anything, understood? Martin nodded, feigning fear. Bart issued a few more threats and left. But Martin had seen what he needed, desperation. Jacob was cornered. 14 years of waiting, 3 murders, and now the law investigating. The merchant was going to make a desperate move. And desperate moves were mistakes. The mistake came the following night. Martin was in the cellar digging another fake hole when he heard muffled voices upstairs. He climbed silently and spied through the gap between the planks. Jacob and Bart were in the main room, but they weren't alone. Mrs. Higgins was with them, on her knees, crying. The woman tried to warn the sheriff, Jacob was saying. Lucky Bart saw her leaving Celeste's house. Martin felt his blood boil. Mrs. Higgins had tried to help, and now she would pay the price. He couldn't let that happen, but it was 2 armed men against him, unarmed in a confined space. He needed an advantage. The advantage came in the form of the lamp Bart had placed on the table near the window. Martin grabbed a handful of dry dirt from the cellar floor, climbed the stairs slowly, and in one swift motion shoved the trapdoor open with force. The lid slammed against the floor with a loud bang. Jacob and Bart spun around. Martin threw the dirt into Bart's eyes and shoved the table. The lamp fell, the glass shattered, kerosene spread and caught fire instantly. The flames shot up quickly on the dry wood. Martin grabbed Mrs. Higgins and pulled her outside while Bart roared, rubbing his eyes. Jacob tried to put out the fire with his hands, but it was too late. The flames were already licking the walls, the ceiling spreading with frightening speed. Martin ran with Mrs. Higgins away from the cabin. Behind them, Bart and Jacob stumbled out coughing. The entire cabin was ablaze now, lighting up the night like day. And from the main trail came Sheriff Otis Seaver running, accompanied by 3 armed deputies he had brought from Big Timber. Jacob saw the sheriff and understood everything. He tried to run for the woods, but Martin brought him down with a tackle he'd learned in the pastures wrangling steers. The two rolled on the ground, while the cabin roared in flames behind them. Otis Seaver aimed his revolver at Bart, who dropped the shotgun and raised his hands. The cabin burned to the foundation. The flames were so intense, no one could get close. It was only when the fire began to die down near dawn that Martin saw something that made everything make final sense. In the center of what had been the main room, where the heat had been most intense, the earth was exposed. And in the middle of the earth there was a deep hole revealed by the fire. Not under the cellar, not in the walls, but directly under the cast-iron stove that had always been there, too heavy to move, too obvious to suspect. When the sun rose and the ground cooled enough to dig, they found the rest. 276 gold coins in a charred leather sack, and beneath them human bones. Frederick Bauer had been buried there in April of 1875, in the spot where Manuel Garden would build the cabin 3 weeks later. The stove was installed exactly over the grave, sealing the secret. Manuel died before he could retrieve the gold, and Jacob had spent 14 years searching everywhere except the one place that was always in plain sight. Jacob Moore spent the night tied up in one of the town sheds, guarded by the men Sheriff Otis Seaver had brought. Bart was in another shed, separated from his boss for the first time in years. Martin didn't sleep. He sat on the steps of Widow Celeste's house, watching the smoke still rising from the cabin ruins, smelling the acrid scent of burnt wood mixed with something heavier, more definitive. It was the smell of the end of a story that had begun 14 years earlier with greed and blood. When the sun rose completely, painting the sky in orange and pink, Sheriff Otis Seaver organized the exhumation of the bodies from the hidden clearing. Martin guided the group through the tunnel, which was now partially collapsed from the heat of the fire, but still passable. They carried shovels, ropes, and white sheets that Widow Celeste provided with tears in her eyes. The old lady had hosted Frederick Bauer in 1875 and carried a silent guilt all these years for not pressing harder on the suspicions she had at the time. The clearing was exactly as Martin had left it. The 3 mounds of earth, covered by dry leaves and branches, the forest generously threw over everything it wanted to forget. The sheriff assigned his men to dig, while Father Stanislaus, who had insisted on accompanying the group, prayed softly, clutching his crucifix tightly. The old priest seemed to have aged 10 years in a single night. 3 people disappeared from my parish, he murmured between prayers. 3 souls who were under my care, and I did nothing. Martin put a hand on the priest's shoulder. You didn't know where to look, Father, he said gently. Nobody knew. That was what Jacob counted on. The first grave revealed the remains of Lewis Miller. The felt hat Martin had found in the cellar was there, placed over the skull, as if the man had been buried with morbid respect. There wasn't much else besides bones and rags of clothing. Lewis had been there for over a year, and the damp earth of the woods had done its work. The sheriff noted everything in a notebook, made sketches of the body's position, collected the hat as evidence. The second grave held Arthur Pierce, the blacksmith. His skeletal structure showed he had been a large, strong man, which made the murder even more cowardly. Bart had likely attacked him from behind, or at night while the smith slept. The bone-handled knife Martin found wasn't in the grave. It had been left in the cellar as a trophy, proof of Jacob's power over those interrupted lives. The third grave was the most recent and therefore the most disturbing. Felicity Ramos still had recognizable remains of fabric. The dark dress religious women wore, wisps of white hair clinging to the skull. The black bead rosary was entwined in the finger bones, as if she had died praying or as if someone had placed it there afterward. Martin preferred to believe the first option. Mrs. Higgins, who had insisted on joining the group despite the trauma of the previous night, fell to her knees and wept. "I saw her last at the store," she sobbed. "Bought flour and beans for the week. Said she was happy to have found a quiet place to live. Quiet," she repeated with a bitterness that broke the heart. The bodies were wrapped in the white sheets and transported back to the village. Father Stanislaus insisted they be laid out in the church with all the dignity they had been denied in death. Martin helped carry Lewis's remains, feeling the weight too light, remembering that this was once a man who breathed, laughed, had dreams and fears like anyone else. The difference between being alive and being dead was sometimes just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or accepting cheap housing from a man with eyes too hard. Back in the village, the news had spread like fire in dry grass. Every resident of Dry Creek was on the main street, forming a silent corridor as the bodies passed. Some women wept. Men took off their hats. Children were held by their mothers, protected from the sight, but not the understanding that something terrible had happened right under everyone's noses for more than a year. Jacob Moore was brought from the shed to see. Sheriff Otis Sever insisted on it. He wanted the killer to face the result of his actions in the light of day, before the people he had deceived for years. Jacob had his hands tied behind his back, his clothes soiled with dirt and soot from the previous night, his face marked by scratches from the fight with Martin. But what was most striking was his expression. There was no remorse, no shame, not even fear, just cold anger and calculation. Jacob looked at the three bodies wrapped in white sheets, and his mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. 14 years, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. 14 years waiting, and in the end, it was a stupid fire that revealed what I was looking for. The sheriff slapped the back of Jacob's head so hard, the man stumbled. "Show some respect," he ordered with an iron voice, "or I'll gag you right here." And if you're following this story so far, leave a comment on what you think. Stories like this need to be told so they are never forgotten. The following days were a whirlwind of formal investigation. Sheriff Otis Sever summoned the circuit judge, who arrived accompanied by a clerk and 2 deputies. They set up a makeshift court in the church itself, as it was the only building large enough to accommodate everyone who wanted to testify. Martin was the first witness, recounting everything from his arrival to the fire. His voice was steady, the details precise. Years as a foreman had taught him to observe and report with accuracy. Mrs. Higgins testified about her attempts to warn Martin, about the fear Jacob inspired in the community, about how everyone knew but no one spoke. Father Stanislaus presented the parish records showing the disappearances and, crucially, the note about Frederick Bauer in 1875. Widow Celeste, trembling with age and emotion, confirmed that the German peddler had stayed at her house and left with 300 gold coins he himself mentioned, drunk on wine his last night. Bart was interrogated separately. The henchman tried to maintain loyalty to his boss for 2 hours, denying everything, claiming he just worked at the store and knew nothing. That was when the judge, a stern man of 60, with a voice that cut through lies like a sharp knife, placed a simple choice on the table. Either you confess your participation and maybe get a reduced sentence, or you protect Jacob and face the rope together with him for 3 murders. You have 5 minutes to decide. Bart broke in 3. He confessed he had killed Lewis Miller on Jacob's orders when the drover came proud to show the 4 coins he found under the bedroom floorboards. Confessed he strangled Arthur Pierce with a hemp rope when the blacksmith dug in the cellar and found 7 coins. Confessed he broke Felicity Ramos's neck when the widow discovered 11 coins in a wall crevice and wanted to return them to the priest, thinking they were forgotten money that should go to the church. All 3 victims were killed at night, dragged through the tunnel and buried in the clearing. All thought they had discovered a forgotten fortune. All paid with their lives for the discovery. Jacob heard Bart's confession with a face of stone. When it was his turn to speak, he denied nothing, confirmed he had been an accomplice to Manuel Garden in the murder of Frederick Bauer in 1875, though he hadn't committed the act itself. Confirmed he spent 14 years looking for the gold Manuel hid before dying. Confirmed he ordered the 3 deaths when the victims found pieces of the treasure. And when the judge asked if he had anything to say in his defense, Jacob spoke with a clear voice free of tremors. "Everyone in this room would do the same in my place," he said, looking around. 300 gold coins are worth more than 3 lives of people who had nothing, who were nothing, who the world wasn't going to miss. Lewis was a failed drover. Arthur was a blacksmith with no future. Felicity was an old, lonely widow. They were going to die of hunger or sickness anyway. I just hurried the inevitable, and if the fire hadn't destroyed the cabin, I'd have the gold now, and no one would know a thing. The only mistake I made was not realizing that Manuel, that clever bastard, had put the stove over the grave. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to suck the air out of the church. Then a voice rose up. It was an old man in the back, thin as a fishing pole, whom Martin didn't know. "I'm Lewis's cousin," the old man said with a voice shaking with contained rage. "He had a wife and 2 children in Miles City. Those children grew up without a father, thinking he had abandoned them. His wife died of grief 3 years ago, still waiting for him to come back. And you say he was nothing?" Another voice, a young woman in mourning. "Arthur Pierce was my uncle. He had plans to open a shop, marry, build a life, dreamed of making the best branding irons in the territory. And you say he had no future?" And a third voice, Felicity Ramos's niece, who had reported the disappearance, a woman with a face marked by recent suffering. "My aunt raised 5 orphan nephews, including me, after our parents died of typhoid. Worked as a washerwoman until her fingers bled to feed us. When we finally grew up and became independent, she deserved peace and rest. And you took that from her for 11 coins?" Jacob didn't answer. He just looked away, and for the first time, Martin saw something other than cold calculation in those eyes. It was just a flash, quick as lightning, but it was there. Maybe conscience, maybe just anger at getting caught. Martin would never know. The trial was quick. The judge needed no more than 2 hours to deliberate. Jacob Moore and Bart were sentenced to death by hanging, the sentence to be carried out in the territorial capital where there was a proper gallows. While awaiting transfer, they would be held in the Big Timber jail. Jacob's family, wife and 3 children didn't show up to say goodbye. They had left Dry Creek the same morning as the exhumation, taking only the clothes on their backs, abandoning the store and everything inside. The shame was too heavy to carry in public. The fate of the gold was decided by the judge with the wisdom of someone who understood both the law and human nature. Of the 276 coins found under the stove, plus the 24 that had been discovered by the victims and recovered from the graves, totaling 300 coins, as Frederick Bauer had mentioned, a portion would be destined for the victims' families as compensation for the loss. 100 coins divided among the relatives of Lewis, Arthur and Felicity. 50 coins would go to the heirs of Frederick Bauer, if they could be located in Great Falls or Germany. And the remaining 150 coins would be divided between Martin Caldwell and Mrs. Higgins as a reward for risking their lives to bring the truth to light. Martin tried to refuse. said he had only done what was right, that he didn't deserve to be rewarded for acting with decency, but the judge was inflexible. "You went to live in that cabin knowing it was a trap," he argued. "Stayed there as conscious bait to force Jacob to reveal himself. That goes far beyond decency. That is courage that deserves to be recognized. And besides," he added with pragmatism, "you're going to need this money to rebuild your life. Your reputation was destroyed by lies. Gold buys lawyers who can reverse that. Take it." Martin accepted, and when he received the 75 coins that were his share, he felt a weight that wasn't just precious metal. It was the weight of responsibility, of a second chance, of the possibility of truly starting over. Mrs. Higgins, who received the same amount, wept, embracing her sick husband. "We'll be able to pay for treatment in Helena," she said between sobs. "We'll be able to have a dignified life. Thank God. Thank God." The funerals for Lewis Miller, Arthur Pierce, and Felicity Ramos took place on a June morning, with a clear sky and the biting cold of early winter. Martin helped carry the 3 simple pine coffins the village carpenter made without charge. Father Stanislaus celebrated a solemn mass with song and incense, giving the 3 victims the farewell they deserved. They were buried in the small cemetery beside the church, under 3 wooden crosses where Martin himself had carved the names with care. After the funeral, while people slowly dispersed, Martin stood there between the 3 fresh graves. He thought about how life was fragile and unfair. How 3 people had woken up on different days, made simple plans for that day, and never saw the sun set again. How one man's greed had stolen not just lives but futures, dreams, possibilities that would never be realized. Lewis would never see his children grow. Arthur would never open his shop. Felicity would never have her deserved rest. But he also thought about how the truth, even taking 14 years, had prevailed. How 3 deaths were not forgotten. How justice, however late, had been done. And how he himself, a man who had arrived in Dry Creek defeated and hopeless, had been an instrument of that justice simply by refusing to accept the convenient silence. Sheriff Otis Sever came to say goodbye 3 days later when he finished all legal procedures. He found Martin helping to dismantle what remained of the burned cabin. The blackened beams, the charred planks, everything being torn down and piled up to be burned for good. The land would be purified by the community itself, who decided in assembly that nothing should remain of that place of death and deceit. "You did the work of an experienced investigator," Otis said, extending his hand. "Ever thought about pursuing that career?" Martin shook the sheriff's hand, feeling the genuine respect in the grip. "I've thought about a lot of things these last few days," he replied, "but investigation isn't for me. I don't want to spend my life looking for the worst in people. I've had enough of that." The sheriff nodded with understanding. "And what will you do now? Go back to cattle?" Martin looked at the smoking ruins of the cabin, then at the hills covered in pines around, then at the clear blue winter sky. "I'm going to buy land," he said finally. "Good land, in a place with a beautiful name, far from ghosts and lies. I'm going to raise horses, not cattle. Noble horses for folks who appreciate a well-treated animal. And I'm going to build a house with my own hands, on high ground where I can see the whole horizon, a place where no secret stays buried, where everything is open and honest as it should be." Otis smiled. "With 75 gold coins, you can do all that and then some. Good luck, Martin. If you ever need a character witness, you can call on me. Your reputation is clean in my eyes." Martin spent 2 more weeks in Dry Creek, helping to organize compensation for the families, providing additional testimony when needed, and simply allowing the town's wound to begin to heal. During that time, he noticed a subtle but profound change in the community. People spoke more openly, questioned more, A merchant from a neighboring town offered a partnership to reopen the store Jacob had abandoned, this time with transparent management and fair prices. Mrs. Higgins's small shop prospered when she used part of the gold to expand stock and renovate the building. On one of the last nights before leaving, Martin was having supper at Widow Celeste's house when the old lady placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him and sat down with a tired sigh. "You saved this town," she said bluntly, "not just finding the killers, but showing all of us that silence is complicity. I carried guilt for 14 years for not shouting louder about Frederick Bauer. Now I can die in peace, knowing the truth finally came to light." Martin took a sip of the strong, bitter coffee. "You weren't to blame, Mrs. Celeste. You couldn't know." "But I suspected," the old woman insisted, "and I chose the comfort of silence over the discomfort of truth. We all did. And 3 people died because of that collective choice. That will mark Dry Creek for generations. But maybe that's good. Maybe the children here will grow up knowing that silence in the face of evil is almost as bad as the evil itself." Martin left Dry Creek on a clear July morning, riding the horse he had bought with the gold coins. In his saddlebags, he carried clean clothes, provisions for a week, documents the judge had provided attesting to his innocence regarding the old theft accusations, and a letter of recommendation signed by Sheriff Otis Seaver himself. He also carried something more valuable that weighed nothing but was worth everything, the certainty that he had done the right thing even when the easy thing was available. The journey north took 3 weeks. Martin crossed rolling plains, forded cold rivers, slept under stars that seemed brighter now that the weight of injustice was no longer on his shoulders. He stopped in towns and cities, always asking about land for sale, always looking for the place that would speak to his heart. He found it in August, in a high plains region near the Canadian border. It was a property of 300 acres, with permanent water, excellent natural pasture, and a view that took his breath away. From the highest points, he could see 3 different valleys and the mountains in the distance, cut against the sky. The owner was a widower too old to continue working the land and accepted 25 gold coins for the place, deed transferred without liens. Martin used 20 more coins to buy 10 mares of good lineage and 2 thoroughbred stallions, the foundation of the breeding operation he planned. He spent another 15 coins on building materials, tools, and hiring an experienced carpenter who taught him as they worked together, raising a solid wooden house with a wide porch facing the sunrise. The remaining 15 coins he kept in a small strongbox buried under the floor of the house, a reserve for emergencies or future investment. The house was finished in November, just before winter hit the plains with force. It was a simple but well-made construction, with 3 bedrooms, a large main room with a stone fireplace, a spacious kitchen, and a pantry. Martin insisted there be no cellar, just a solid floor over a stone foundation, with no empty spaces underneath where secrets could hide. Everything in sight, everything honest, as he had promised himself. On the first Christmas on his own land, Martin received a letter. It was from Sheriff Otis Seaver, informing him that Jacob Moore and Bart had been hanged in the territorial capital on December 18th before a crowd that included the victims' families. Jacob climbed the scaffold without saying a word, without asking for forgiveness, without showing remorse. Bart wept and asked for God's mercy, but not the people's. Justice had been served, the sheriff wrote, and the dead could finally rest in peace. Martin folded the letter slowly and put it in the drawer of the desk he had bought. He felt no satisfaction at the news, nor special relief. Just sadness for the waste of lives. 4 dead, 2 executions, families destroyed, a community marked, all for 300 gold coins that brought happiness to no one. The German peddler died without using them. Manuel Garden died before retrieving them. Jacob waited 14 years and died without enjoying a single day of wealth. And 3 innocent people paid with everything they had simply for being in the wrong place. But from the tragedy, something good had sprouted too. Martin was alive, free, rebuilding a life with recovered dignity. Mrs. Higgins saved her husband and was prospering honestly. The victims' families received compensation that, while not replacing their loved ones, at least offered material comfort. And Dry Creek had learned a lesson that communities rarely learn without paying a high price. Silence is not neutrality, it is a choice that has consequences. The following years brought transformations Martin could barely imagine on that first terrifying night in the cursed cabin. The horse-breeding business prospered. The fame of his noble, well-trained animals spread through the region, and buyers came from far away to acquire colts from the St. Helen Ranch, the name Martin chose in honor of his mother, who died when he was 15. In 1892, 3 years after the events of Dry Creek, Martin married. Clara was the daughter of a doctor in the neighboring town, a 28-year-old woman with formal education and genuine kindness that didn't depend on social standing. They met when Clara came to the ranch to buy a gentle mare for riding. Martin taught her to ride during 6 weeks of lessons that turned into long conversations, then dinners at his house, then a love that grew natural as native grass in the fields. Clara didn't mind when Martin told the whole story of Dry Creek. She listened in silence, holding his hand, and when he finished, she said only, "You did what needed to be done. That doesn't define you. What defines you is what you build now." And Martin loved her even more for that simple and deep wisdom. They had 4 children over 10 years, 2 boys and 2 girls who grew up running through the fields, learning to ride before they could read, developing character under the sun and rain of honest rural life. Martin told the story of Dry Creek to each of them when they reached the appropriate age to understand. Not as an exciting adventure, but as a lesson about choices, consequences, and the importance of doing what is right, even when it is difficult. His oldest son, Henry, asked once why his father hadn't simply accepted Jacob's offer to split the gold. It would be much more money than the reward, he argued with the logic of a 12-year-old boy. Martin took his son to the small family plot he kept on the property, where an old dog the family loved was buried, and explained, "Money gained over the bones of innocence weighs more than lead," he said. "No matter how much it is, it will always seem little, because your conscience never leaves you in peace. I could have had 150 coins, but I wouldn't sleep a tranquil night for the rest of my life. I prefer to have half that and sleep like a child, knowing I did the right thing." Mrs. Higgins came to visit in 1895, bringing her husband who had recovered completely thanks to the treatment in the capital. They spent a week at the ranch, and on nights around the fireplace, they told how Dry Creek had changed. The new store prospered under honest management. Young people who used to flee the village now stayed, building futures. The church had been renovated with community donations. And more importantly, people spoke openly about the past, no longer hiding the shame, but using it as an example of what must not be tolerated. "The tunnel and the clearing were completely destroyed," Mrs. Higgins said. "Men from the village filled the tunnel with dirt and rocks, then planted trees over where the graves were. In 10 years, no one will know that existed, but we raised a monument in the square with the names of Louis, Arthur, and Felicity, so they are always remembered. And under the names is written, 'Silence protects no one, only allows evil to continue.'" Martin thought the inscription perfect. It was a message that summed up everything he had learned in those terrible days of May 1889. Silence for convenience, for fear, for indifference, always ended up feeding what should be confronted. Father Stanislaus passed away in 1897, at 77 years old. Martin learned from Mrs. Higgins' letter and travelled 3 days to attend the funeral. He found Dry Creek transformed. The village had grown, with new houses, better streets, even a real school where before there were only makeshift classes in the sacristy. The new priest, a young man of 30 named Father Anselm, knew the whole story and thanked Martin for bringing justice to his parish before he even arrived. Martin visited the 3 graves. The simple wooden crosses had been replaced by modest stone markers, kept with fresh flowers by community volunteers who took turns weekly. He stood there for a long hour, remembering the objects he found in the cellar, the discovery of the graves, the weight of the decision he had to make. Then he spoke softly, as if the dead could hear. "Your deaths were not in vain. They changed a whole community. That doesn't bring you back, but maybe it means you didn't die completely. You live in memory and in the lesson." Sheriff Otis Seaver kept in contact over the years through occasional letters. He had become chief marshal of the region, responsible for several counties, a respected man whose word was gold in courts. In a letter from 1900, he wrote about how the Dry Creek case had changed his approach to investigation. "I learned that sometimes the right people appear at the right moments," he wrote. "You weren't a lawman, weren't a trained investigator, but you had something more important, a refusal to accept injustice. I try to teach that to the men who work with me now. Technique can be learned, but character you either have or you don't." Martin replied thanking him, but reiterating that he had done nothing extraordinary. Just what any decent man should do when confronted with evident evil. "If that seems extraordinary," he wrote back, "it's because the ordinary has become accepting and moving on, and that needs to change." In 1905, 16 years after the events of Dry Creek, Martin was 50 years old and had an established reputation as a breeder of the best horses in the territory. St. Helen Ranch employed 12 families permanently, paid fair wages, and operated with absolute transparency that was rare for the time. Martin insisted that all workers knew exactly how much the ranch earned and spent, proving that honesty and prosperity were not mutually exclusive. On an autumn afternoon, he was on the porch of the house watching the sun set over the fields when Clara came to sit beside him. She carried an envelope yellowed by time. "Found this tidying up your old papers," she said, handing it to him. "It's the first letter you received from the sheriff about the executions. You never threw it away." Martin took the envelope and looked at it for a long time. "I didn't throw it away because I don't want to forget," he said finally. "Not the murders, not the evil, but what I learned. That a man with nothing can choose to have everything if that everything is dignity and a clean conscience. That fortune built on blood is never worth it. That silence has too high a price. These are lessons I want our children to carry and their children after." Clara rested her head on her husband's shoulder. "They will carry them," she said with absolute certainty, "because you teach not just with words, but with life. They see how you treat the workers, how you do business, how you sleep peaceful every night. That's worth more than any sermon." Martin embraced his wife, feeling profound gratitude for everything he had. A family he loved, land that was his, work that fulfilled him, and principally an inner peace that came from knowing his hands were clean, his conscience quiet, his name honored not by birth or money, but by consistent choices over years. "There was a time," he said thoughtfully, "when I would have given anything just to clear my name of Colonel Fenton's false accusations. I thought reputation was everything, but Dry Creek taught me different. Reputation is what others think of you. Character is what you really are. In the end, only the second matters." Martin Caldwell lived to be 72, passing away in 1927, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a wife who loved him for 35 years. More than 200 people attended the funeral. Ranch hands carried the coffin. The priest spoke of a life well lived, of a legacy of honesty and courage. And when the body was lowered into the earth of the fields he loved, everyone agreed the world was a better place for Martin having passed through it. Years later, when the grandchildren were grown and told stories of their grandfather, they always included the episode of Dry Creek, not as an adventure of hero against villain, but as a lesson about the moment a man defeated by injustice chose not to perpetuate injustice when he had the chance. A moment when material poverty didn't mean poverty of spirit. A moment when doing right mattered more than personal gain. The cabin where 3 people vanished was never rebuilt. The land became part of the Dry Creek town square, with a garden where children play without knowing the history of the soil beneath their feet. But the monument to the 3 dead is still there, with the names clear and the inscription reminding everyone that silence before evil is not neutrality, it is complicity. And on winter nights, when the wind comes down cold from the hills and whistles through the pines, the old-timers of Dry Creek still tell the story of the man who arrived with nothing, faced a powerful killer, and chose truth instead of gold. They tell it so the new generations understand that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting correctly despite the fear. That justice sometimes delays, but when it arrives, it's worth every day of waiting. And that a life is worth infinitely more than any quantity of gold coins, no matter how much they shine in the sunlight. The story of Martin Caldwell and the cursed cabin became a regional legend, but a legend based on documented facts that anyone can verify in the records of Dry Creek and Big Timber. And the lesson remains relevant decades later. There are choices that define not just what we get, but who we are. Martin chose to be a man of clear conscience instead of a man of full pockets. And that choice, made in May of 1889 in a dark cabin at the edge of the woods, echoed for the rest of his life and through the lives of everyone he touched. Because in the end, when the earth covers everyone equally and time erases even the most vivid memories, what remains is not how much we had, but how we lived, not how much we accumulated, but how much we gave, not how much we hid, but how much we revealed. And Martin Caldwell, the man who went to live in the cabin where 3 owners vanished in sequence and discovered the reason, lived and died knowing his entire life was built on a solid foundation of truth, justice, and dignity that no gold in the world could buy.